Welcome to this second session. In this session, we are going to introduce a new phenomenon, the role of supply chains. Earlier, we were asked to reflect on the relationship between the global trade order and economic security. Now we are being asked to reflect on the relationship between the trading order and supply chains. As an economist, I tend to think of these as two different technologies. A corporate technology, a supply chain, a form of organization, and an institutional legal technology, which we agree on at the international level. Naturally, when one thinks about this, one wants to ask, well, what objectives are we trying to get and to attain with these two technologies? Does each technology reinforce each other or possibly undercut each other? These are the questions one might want to ask. Now, of course, in the current context of trying to deliver economic security, if that is the objective, which combination of multilateral trade rules and supply chains helps take us towards that objective, and which configurations take us in the wrong direction? That's what I would like to learn from this session, but I know I'm going to learn a lot more as well. So to start, we have a presentation by Professor KAWASE, and he is from Sophia University. Please, Professor KAWASE, the floor is yours.
Okay, I thank you for the very kind introduction, and Professor EVENETT. And first of all, I'm apologizing for my speaking in Japanese, and because the secretariat was interacted me to do so. That's the first reason. And the second reason, as you know, I'm very lousy English speaker, and also if my friend Aki has a heavy jet lag. I'm suffering from the hay fever, and also a little bit medicated. So maybe my Japanese word speech will be much more clear my English speaking. So let me switch my language into the Japanese.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation, and thank you very much for the kind introduction as well. My name is KAWASE. In front of such illustrious people, Dr. INOMATA and Dr. MAURO and Professor EVENETT, it is indeed a great honor and privilege to be the speaker for this session. Now, the issue given me is the trade order based upon multilateral rules and supply chain. But we have a WTO and CPTPP, more traditional trade agreements, with building the friendshoring in the Indo-Pacific. And there are also new agreements such as IPEF and such. I would like to speak about both. Now, for the 7 years or so, ever since the Trump administration has been born, the international community have been facing many crises repeatedly, the disruption of supply chain and such. And with the trade conflict between the U.S. and China, as well as the geopolitical developments, including the Ukrainian war, we also had pandemic of COVID-19, the lockdowns and limitations on the travel and so forth. There was great impression that there are many natural disasters which would become a crisis for the supply chain as well, like the big earthquake back in 2011 in Japan, as well as the big flooding in Thailand, and also the earthquakes in Hualien in Taiwan. There was not much impact on the semiconductor production, but if there have been any impact on TSMC, the production, it could have led to disruption of supply chain and a serious shortage of semiconductor. In the past, food, energy, pharmaceuticals, the home appliances, and IT, the products, and automobiles, those essential the products, as well as the livelihood the products, have been hampered in its production as well as supply due to disruption supply chain because of many crises. And the shortage of semiconductor would negatively impact the production of the civilian goods, and in short term also for the military goods, including cruise missiles as well as drones and such. And there has been strengthening of export restraints vis-à-vis China in terms of semiconductor as well as manufacturing technology, with the U.S. imposing such restraints to the countries of concern in terms of national security. If we do have part of our supply chain being deployed to those countries, there could be risk of leakage of sensitive technology. And in both export and import, economic coercion has been employed by China from time to time, and there had been an energy supply stymied because of Russia's moves vis-à-vis Ukraine and Europe. And from time to time, there are risks of economic statecraft being applied to certain countries because of the sovereign intervention into the trade restraints. That is to say, weaponizing all these trade restraints. In order to make the supply chain more resilient, there could be many methodologies. For example, supply chain which are deployed internationally could be disrupted because of circumstances where domestic control cannot be effective. So the supply source of the necessary products, we need to think about strategies such as China Plus One to try to diversify the production basis and also make visible a more complicated supply chain, and to introduce early warning system for the supply chain. And looking at the U.S. situation, the Biden administration initially have imposed executive order to include 10 sectors such as semiconductor, as well as the large capacity batteries and critical minerals, to point to the vulnerability of supply chains, and also suggested improvements. In such recommendations included diversification of supply chain, and to have a domestic production as well as research capability to be revamped inside the country, and also to increase the government procurement and public investments into those relevant areas. And more recently, United States is suggesting friendshoring. The Secretary Gallen says that friendshoring means that we have a group of countries that have strong adherence to a set of norms to make sure that we can supply needs of critical materials through working together. That's to say, we need to come out of offshoring or outsourcing and have the friendly nations and the allies coming together to formulate supply chain where geographical and geopolitical risks are minimized, to try to have friendshoring to be built, and also reshoring are also to be encouraged. In the Chips and Science Act, the guardrail, the stipulations have been included, and also fiscal support have been provided to try to restrict investment into countries of concern, with China especially being envisaged. And in the IRA, in the tax credit to cover electric vehicles, the production as well as refinery of the critical minerals needed for EV production should be produced inside the United States, as well as those countries having FTAs or something comparable to FTA, such as critical minerals agreement with the U.S., to be restricted to those countries. But how can we be able to establish friendshoring within the Indo-Pacific, and how can trade agreements contribute to such a framework? I'm sure you know of this very well, but once again, I would like to reflect upon what constitutes global supply chain. Global supply chain is one country or one company cannot make all of the production processes for finished products. We need to outsource part of such process to the other countries or other companies to combine the offshoring as well. Professor Baldwin said that with the development of communications as well as the transportation, the second unbundling have happened ever since 1990s. That is to say, a step forward from the first unbundling, which means separation of production and consumption through trade, but more of a geographical separation has been seen for the production processes, with a global supply chain being formed. In the global supply chains, not only the finished products, but for parts and components, as well as semi-products, you have overseas operations and also investment into the mergers and acquisition, and you have technology and know-how and trademarks crossing the border. And Baldwin has named this Trade Investment Services Intellectual Property Nexus, where the big data are being shared amongst the operations, and sometimes the staffs as well as the management people who will move from operation to operation. Now, if there is company A, company Alpha, having headquarters in country A, would also have operation and production bases in countries B and C and D. And they also have transactions with independent component suppliers in different countries. And amongst these operations and suppliers, for example, for automobiles and PCs, up until one product is being completed, again and again, there will be goods, people, services, and money, and parts will cross border many times. And then, for the trade agreements, how will it be related to such a process? First and foremost, to liberalize the cross-border movement of such production factors and try to bring down the cost of operation as well as deployment of supply chain. In the finished product trade, crossing the border will only be once, but in the global supply chain, there will be frequent crossing of the border of parts and components as well as semi-products. And accumulation of the monetary cost and time necessary to going through the custom procedures and tariffs will be a big burden, but you will be able to simplify the customs procedure by eliminating the tariffs and so forth. And in the trade agreements, you can liberalize investment into establishing the overseas operations, and you can liberalize the movement of data as well as the people, and also services transaction. And more recently, for the behind the border, the non-discriminatory handling or the schemes to ensure transparency have been established. And by guaranteeing the operation overseas, you can reduce the risk for the global supply chain and enhance the predictability. And that is also the special role of trade agreements.
So typical trade agreement that supports the realization of such a supply chain in a wide region is CPTPP. In this way, rules in each chapter of CPTPP leads to cost reduction and or greater predictability. And global supply chain contribution is much made by CPTPP. Now, while WTO supports only limited liberalization of trade and service, and it does not have discipline on investment liberalization and protection and digital trade, and also in Indo-Pacific FTA, RCEP has the lower level of ambition in terms of trade liberalization and rules. Therefore, CPTPP has a greater contribution to global supply chain. But unfortunately, as you know, due to the absence of the U.S., CPTPP cannot be fully functioning as the base for friendshoring in this region. And on the other hand, due to domestic political situation, the U.S. is unable to engage in trade negotiation to commit to market access, including tariff reduction. Instead of that, the U.S. is now promoting a new trade framework focused on supply chain resiliency. Now, in terms of Multilateral initiative, IPEF and also APEP, covering Americas, and on the bilateral front, the US-EU TTC and Japan-US Economic 2+2 and the US-Taiwan initiative, and also sectoral base for critical minerals and semiconductors framework has been launched. IPEF has 4 pillars: trade, supply chain, clean economy, free economy, and Pillar 2 agreement took effect in February this year. And regarding supply chain, Ambassador Catherine Tai, USTR, said something to the effect that Pillar 1 creates a system of incentives to build regional supply chain and provides flexibility for supply chain. And Pillar 2 focuses on transparency and stable operation of supply chain, allowing us to brace for supply chain disruption and bottlenecks. What she implies is, in a nutshell, suppose Pillar 2 agreement is to ensure stability of supply chain. Trade agreement like Pillar 1 is a framework that reduces cost of supply chain formation and restructuring and increases predictability through elimination of trade barriers. In other words, friendshoring within IPEF region is achievable only when these 2 pillars complement each other. However, in November last year in San Francisco, Pillar 1 agreement was not reached, as you know. In addition, the supply chain-focused trading framework, like IPEF, does not have binding rules for tariff reduction, investment protection and liberalization, and elimination of non-tariff barriers. Therefore, unlike CPTPP, it cannot sufficiently ensure cost reduction in building supply chain or regulatory risk reduction or predictability. Therefore, IPEF Pillar 1 alone would not be enough to promote friend-sharing building in the Indo-Pacific. Also, trade liberalization realized through traditional trade agreement can secure resilience of global supply chain in the face of external shock, and that has been proven recently we're facing economic coercion. Mr. Tamura talked about Australian example. In 2020, then Prime Minister of Australia, Prime Minister Morrison, called for independent investigation into the origin of COVID-19, and China responded with anti-dumping duties to barley and wine, and also SPS and TBT measures on beef, lumber, and timber. And however, under WTO and CPTPP, which guarantees free trade, Australia was able to find alternative markets. But on the other hand, they use WTO dispute settlement and effectively neutralized the coercive measures. Since autumn last year, gradually the relationship between Australia and China has improved, and one by one restriction is being lifted. And Lithuania faced China's import ban as well in retaliation to Taiwan's establishment of RIP office. However, thanks to EU cooperation and other measures, country was able to emerge from this crisis, and also the Lithuania is using a WTO DS mechanism. G7 trade ministers' statement in October last year in Osaka, Sakai, explores ways to mitigate harm of economic coercion. So as long as free trade is ensured, it is achievable. Because countries can help each other to find alternative markets and supplies within G7 countries or beyond, including Australia, among friendly countries. According to WTO 2023 World Trade Report, it says that with many empirical analysis that the free trading system is effective in countering economic coercion and recovery from supply chain shocks like the one we experienced during the pandemic. So in this way, trade agreements is vital as a platform for a resilient supply chain, and free trade is not something that would undermine or weaken supply chain. Therefore, it is obviously our policy option is to strengthen a free trade system, particularly if we are to promote venturing in the Indo-Pacific. CPTPP has to be expanded and updated going forward, and also IPF in itself is not sufficient, but they can pursue a complementarity with the CPTPP as a framework to realize resilient regional supply chain. Therefore, it is important to accelerate Pillar 1 negotiations and the implementation of Pillar 2. In addition, mega FTA is often said to be a stepping stone to a multilateral trade system. In order to give more flexibility and freedom in developing supply chain, we should consider linking CPTPP to the EU with an opportunity provided by the UK's accession, and also we should consider linking it with other mega FTA and customs union. And also, building a supply chain resiliency, WTO must remain as a bedrock. WTO is taken for granted, but had it not been for WTO, trade bogs down immediately. So it's like a water and air infrastructure. We have to accelerate a negotiation on outstanding issues from MC13 and reinvigorate WTO negotiations, and to restore currently dysfunctioning DS mechanism to make sure the rules are enforced. And also, I am not denying the importance of economic security in the face of growing geopolitical tensions, but maintenance of free trade system is also indispensable for ensuring economic security in order to prevent protectionist measures from being introduced endlessly without any censure in the name of security and undermining the rule-based free trade regime. We must limit trade restrictions with security exemptions to the minimum. Namely, we have to keep small yard high fence. That is my view. This concludes my remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now we turn to the first of our two discussants, Dr. INOMATA, please, from JETRO.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. My name is INOMATA. I am with the JETRO and Institute of Developing Economies. I would also like to speak in Japanese. Now, to the presentation made by Professor KAWASE, my only comment, or rather the only point of question to be raised, is as follows. Is friendshoring conducive or detrimental to the multilateral trading system? This is the point that I would like to make. Now, the former head of CEPR, Professor Richard Baldwin, said on the governance of international economy in the globalization age, the 20th century governance, the traditional trade modes, have been compared with the 21st century the governance or strategy with the global value chains to be the premise. He has drawn a very clear line between the two. What I will be explaining may sound like preaching to the Buddha, but for the 20th century, a trade strategy would be the concept of international trade is made here and sold there. This is a binomial formula. Thus, the trade strategy would be, I will open my market if you open yours. That is a mirror image principle. Through border measures to be eliminated or to be reduced, that is to say tariff levels, it is more of a shallow trade agreement being the major tool. On the other hand, for the 21st century approach, in lieu of made here and sold there, it will be made everywhere and sold there. The global value chains will be the basis. And the major player will be the multinational corporates. And by optimizing the supply chain, they will deploy their production operation globally. So goods, money, people, and information for the international flow, it would be desirable to establish common set of rules amongst as many countries as possible. For the multinationals or the government pushing forward such businesses will be mostly or primarily it will be the industrialized countries. Their negotiation position would be, I give you my factories if you do your own reform. So that would be the stance. The justified competition or protection of intellectual property rights to have a deep its trade agreement to be built by intervening into domestic systems. Therefore, the 20th century governance, that is to say, more of a mirror image, a type of a pattern, will be the relationship amongst the parties on equal footing. But in the 21st century governance, it will be a relationship of overwhelming power gap between the rule setters and rule followers. And the gap of the power would be the difference in capital as well as technological prowess. The industrialized countries will have FDI, that is technological transfer and capital transfer, and in exchange of such cards, the developing countries would have to comply with the common rules or to reform their system. And the 21st century governance do have weaknesses in the structure because it is global value change as a promise. And in actuality, the developing countries would very rapidly catch up in technology. So they would shake the absolute superiority of the industrialized countries. But for the LDCs who do not have capital formation or capital accumulation that much, such an old negotiation card still may be effective. Now, what about China and India, those emerging powers? To follow through on domestic reform, which may bring about great pains. Would they agree to that, to such a deal with industrialized countries? Or such emerging powers, many, numerously, would have their own global companies, and they would have independent rules and have a 21st century type of governance. For example, Belt and Road Initiative by China, such gigantic economic zone are to be created. This would be the Chinese version of the 21st century governance. Now, looking at that IPEF and friendshoring, the digital transformation, the green transformation, what may be essential? The critical minerals, and mostly are concentrated in the developing economies. And this is something making highly complicated and difficult the 21st century type of governance. Having said so, looking at IPEF, this is one tool of friendshoring policies, and the Biden administration are actually making this clear in the executive order. And the Biden administration has also put forward Build Back a Better World to try to promote infrastructure development as well as technological cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. And the IPEF as well as B3W, the Build Back Better world, are being positioned to be the two wheels of a cart for the Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States. But from the developing economies' point of view, they are seen as one negotiating package. What IPEF tries to put forth, high level of international rules. So in exchange of abiding by such rules, through the B3W, the developing economies will be able to gain infrastructure assistance as well as technological cooperation. And as Professor Baldwin has said, the 21st type of international governance are now becoming a reality in the Indo-Pacific. For the developing economy, the governments, they would have to accept great pains by reforming their domestic the system. But on the other hand, they will be able to gain benefits on the demand side through market access, through the CPTPP. But 7 countries from the ASEAN have already expressed their participation. And with the division of the international rules, and as the race for the 21st century international governance becomes fierce, economic decoupling as a regime could be firmly established. So once again, we need to review on the IPEF as well as friendshoring policies for its long-term effects. We need to carefully analyze those aspects. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much. Now we turn to the final discussant, which is Professor Veda de Mauro, who is the president of CPR and a professor at the Graduate Institute of Geneva. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Uwata-san and RIETI, for inviting me to do this presentation, and more importantly, even for 10 years of successful collaboration between RIETI and CEPR. We do hope that we are looking at least 10 further years of such collaboration, because something is clear. It is important that analytical input on these critical questions is shared, and that we continue working on them among friends. The word friends will play a role in my presentation. I also want to thank Dr. Kawasabe for his insightful presentation with which I have very few disagreements, and therefore what I decided to do is provide a complementary European perspective on the same issues that he is discussing. So, Japan and Europe share some traits which are unfortunate in these times, and that they are both not part of the great power struggle going on between the US and China, but they are somewhere in between and do need to find their way in this. I want to take a step back and look at the history of the last 30 years, and then I will give you a preview, a sneak preview, of the Paris report, which is the ITCAI that Tamura-san has already advertised. Thank you very much. Which is a joint work with Bruegel and CEPR, in which we decided to do some deep investigation of what economic security implies for from a European perspective, but the policy implications do also carry beyond Europe. It is a sneak preview because the Paris report itself will be launched and published 2 weeks from now in Berlin. So, looking back, that was 1992, when Francis Fukuyama declared the end of history. And it was a very shared sentiment. It was the view was that we have reached a point where ideologies no longer divide the world, where geography increasingly becomes unimportant. And by the way, as one of the consequences of all of the developments that followed, it might also be the end of poverty and deep divisions economically. What then followed, in fact, is something a bit of that type. I'm using here another title of another book, Thomas Friedman, because I always liked that book's image, The World is Flat. Although, of course, you understand that of a flat world you can also fall off because there are borders at the end. But let's ignore that for the moment. The world flattened. There was the great moderation. Inflation was falling. Interest rates were falling. Poverty, in fact, was falling dramatically. Inequality across countries was becoming lower. Within some countries, it was increasing, as this is one of the problems, but across countries, it was falling. Rising globalization, it's the age of the global value chains. It is also the age of dollar dominance and of global citizenship. This is only a selection of everything that happened, and we have been just living through these 30 years. And now, arguably, we have faced or have seen the end of history. The large crises that have shook us all collectively over the last 5 to 6, 7 years, starting with crisis of populism, pandemic, trade war, China, and now the biggest shock for Europe, war in Europe. These are a few titles of CEPR books that were published very recently, all of them, and you see already from the titles that it is about geoeconomics. We are worried about the international order, financial and trade order, and we are worried about peace. What is the consequence of all of this, and how should we think about in terms of, in this new world, in terms of economic security? It's the policy part that I am giving you here a small insight into, and it is joined with Jean Pisani-Ferry and Jeremy Sedlmeier. We started out by thinking about and trying to define more precisely what actually do we mean by economic security. Because too broad a definition of economic security implies that very many things might be included that we may not want to be included. And here is a classification that may be helpful, we think, very helpful. Let's think first at the origin of the shock. Traditionally, and still in the future, a lot of the shocks may be domestic. The European euro crisis or banking crisis is just an example of that. Domestic origin and domestic consequences that may also have spillovers to the rest of the world through trade and finance. A second type of shock, so these are just economic crises. A second type of shock is clearly external, and the best example of that is COVID. An external shock, unexpected, and it endangers, it causes crisis through the propagation, in this case also disease, health, finance, trade, etc. A third type, and this is really the new unfortunate type of shock that we may also have to consider in the future, is deliberate action or aggression of another nation. The example for Europe here is, of course, the Russian aggression in the Ukraine and what happened after that in terms of the enormous disruption in the energy supply, in the gas supply, and the eventual stopping of that, the enormous increases in energy costs in Europe, but I know this is did not stay in Europe, food prices, etc., as a consequence of a deliberate action. So for economic security risks, we suggest that both these type of external shocks, exogenous external shocks, but also deliberate types of coercion and aggression should be encompassed. Now, let me, skip over a lot of intermediate steps and go very straight to one part of the analysis and then to the consequences. So the first thing that, and this comes largely from the first type of shock, supply chains choking up, highlighted how much the global value chains had become a transmission channel also of negative, not only of positive things, but also of negative things, and has highlighted the importance of import dependence. And one of the first reactions, and I know that in Japan also people have been working on trying to define better where are we import dependent and how can we somehow become more resilient, how can we ensure against these types of negative shocks in our supply chains. This is the exercise that was conducted by Isabelle Mégin and her co-author for this Paris report. We're doing, ideally, let me just say this briefly, ideally we would like to know this at the firm level. We would like to know the supply chain of every firm and understand where, if we disrupt something, what happens through the firms and their connected firms in the domestic economy. We don't have that kind of data. We have to do this at the product level, basically at the border level. And this is the way that the European Union already approached it in order to define critically important products and critical import dependencies. Now, what Isabelle and her co-author did is really strongly refine the methodology to take into account not only static effects of the trade matrix, but also dynamic substitution possibilities within and outside. And when you take those into account, then what is happening here is that from a relatively large number of possibly critical import dependencies products, you go down to quite few. And only a small part of those, in turn, are due to China. So taking into account possibilities of substitution is very important in order to do the analysis correctly and not to overshoot. That's a first lesson. You want to be very careful in defining import dependencies by taking into account as much as you can the substitution possibilities, but this already also points to a second point. It very much depends where you can substitute to, especially if you're not a large market, internal market like the European Union, or put differently, who are your friends? Who are the like-minded countries where substitution may be possible or not? And this, again, is not something that is fully defined at the moment. And that is part of the problem of any type of this analysis. If you cut trade with something, and this is a second type of analysis, let me just talk to this without a graph, that we did in the context of this project, and that is to look what if the European Union did decouple from China in a sudden way. What would be the costs to output? Well, not surprisingly, and in particular in Germany, the impact of such a decoupling would be quite large on output. The estimate is something more than 6% of output immediately. But if you decouple more slowly, gradually, and if you have substitution possibilities, then the costs are much smaller. And one of the consequences for that is we may have to buy insurance by partly reducing dependence also from exports, not only from imports. So this points then to export dependence. This is the chart, or the summary table with where we look at what has the European Union done, and what you should take away from this table, a lot. These are all the available instruments. Most of these are new. European Chips Act, Critical Raw Materials Act, Net Zero Industry Act. Many of them are reactions to such acts that were passed in the US or to new vulnerabilities that were perceived, like in the health sector. And they tend to be mostly focused on reducing import dependency for critical products. We have, some quibbles with these instruments, whether they are weak or not. But then there is, in fact, these other types of vulnerabilities. What if your exports is where you are dependent? What about export concentration? There is no real instrument for that except for making friends. Then there is the question of what about real economic coercion? It already has also been mentioned. The EU, since last December, has an anti-coercion instrument, which in principle has very encompassing powers for the European Union to respond, to react to perceived economic or to economic coercion or aggression. But it has very high hurdles to be activated. So the question is, will it be ever activated? Under what kind of circumstances would this high hurdle be jumped? Then there is the open question of, should European Union contemplate reducing or limiting over time the dependency of the Chinese market? And what would be the cost of that? So we do not have, we don't take a strong stance on that, but we do show that one of our papers shows that if one is to do this slowly, gradually, it's much less costly than if it happens all of a sudden. And this is, of course, the lesson from Ukraine and from Russia. If all of a sudden you have to change everything, then it is extremely costly. So, in summary, the world of the Great Moderation is probably gone and not coming back. So geography is coming back. It matters where you are and who your friends are. Political and economic fragmentation are increasing, and ideology is also increasingly back. Our recommendation is be prepared, buy insurance. Yes, this is costly and therefore has to be weighed against the size and the probability of the risks, but definitely it is not enough to look just at import dependence. Also concentrated exports and coercion risks have to be in scope. A dedicated anti-coercion instruments hopefully have a certain deterring effect. And last but not least, this is very important for the EU, less important for Japan. The single market, strengthen the single market and speak with one voice. Europe is not one. Some of these instruments or some of these aggressions might also serve to try and divide and conquer Europe. So joint action and speaking with one voice is extremely important. Avoid, and this is very important to end on this, avoid protectionism and capture by special interests, because this is the danger of contemplating all of these types of new instruments, that they end up being simple protectionism of inefficient producers and subsidy races with other countries, but also within Europe itself. So this is the trade-off. This is the trade-off that needs to be kept in mind. Thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you, Beatrice. We have 3 minutes left. What I would like to do is just share with you some questions that we've received. We will not have the time to answer them, but I think just reflecting on the comments from our colleagues in the audience, I think is something we can all do afterwards. One question which has been put to us is, to what extent can global private companies act in an era of geopolitical risks without being seen to favor any one particular country? So the question here, I guess, inside the question is, to what extent can one remain a nationality-blind multinational? So that was one reflection which colleagues seem to have thought was important. The second one is to what extent is managing economic security risks different from normal risk management procedures? And is the difference driven by the fact that there could be malicious actors out there who are trying to weaponize trade flows? Is that the intellectual difference between the two? And there was also a suggestion that could a rules-based consensus deter such malicious acts? Assuming presumably the question inside the question then is if we can agree what a malicious act is in the first place. So these were some reflections we've heard from our colleagues. More generally, in listening to the three presentations, essentially we've heard how potential plurilateral and regional solutions could be advanced to try and enhance economic security. This was, I think, the unifying theme from all three presentations. We've heard about this in the context of the Asia-Pacific region, more generally in the context of the unbundling, which our colleague Richard Baldwin has talked about, and lastly in the context of Europe. I think in all three cases, the question I would have is to what extent, how can we judge if these initiatives are successful? Because what we're talking about is not the growth of supply chains, but actually reducing the disruption to them, the likely disruption to them. And it will be interesting to see how we can think about measuring that or gauging that, because if we are going to buy insurance, insurance is costly. What are we getting in return, and how can we be sure that that insurance is worth paying? So that's just a final thought from my side, and I'd like to wrap this session up with less than 1 minute to spare. Thank you very much.